Hello again. We're getting down to it. There's not a whole lot left. We're on part 5, and the city of Troy was just sacked, and it was brutal and very violent, and really sad. We are on chapter 3. This one's called The Women. So Aeneas got out of the city with his sons. And we kind of knew that his sons would survive because there was the prophecy at the beginning of the book that said that his sons would go on to be the rulers of far off lands in Asia and whatnot. But his wife was left behind, and I'm guessing all of her servants. So this, I guess, is going to tell us what happened with them. Chapter 3, The Women. Day dawned on the smoking ruins of Troy. A group of noble women set apart from the other plunder to be prizes for the chieftains huddled together in the shelter of the broken wall, waiting to learn their fates. Pause. During this time in Greece, and then for a long time afterwards in Greece, and for a long time in history, just throughout history, women were not considered citizens. They were the property of their husbands. So the women here are about to be redistributed. They might have been husbands for men in Troy. Now they're just waiting to be redistributed and assigned husbands in other parts of, or for the Greeks, which doesn't sound right. You don't look at your mom and think, oh, she belongs to so-and-so. No, you don't. And if you do, shame on you. But that was the way of life, not only in Troy, but in a lot of parts of the world. And that continues in some parts of the world today. It's a good thing to discuss with your parents. Hecuba's white hair was blown by the wind, and her wrinkled face, which had seemed only yesterday to be carved in lines of rigid pride, was now slack and fallen with hopeless despair. Of all her children, 3 alone remained. Polyxena, her fairest daughter, pressed close against her, stunned by the vista of the long years of misery ahead. Cassandra, the strange prophetess, whose mad fancy had troubled the Trojans through all the years of the war, was combing her hair and singing softly to herself. King Agamemnon, smitten by the sight of her wild, unearthly beauty, had chosen her out of all the captives to be his own, swearing that he would make her his bride in defiance of Clemestra, his proud wife, who waited for him in Mycenae. Cassandra, to whom for years the very name of Agamemnon had brought confused storms of madness and horror, now prepared for her fate with a smile and was calmly decking herself for her bridegroom. The despair of her mother and the sick dread of her sister were hardly even realized as she pondered on the fate she foresaw her bridal would bring to Agamemnon. The hope remained to Hecuba. Her youngest son had been a mere child when the war broke out. At that time, Priam, fearing for the fate of his city, had secretly entrusted the boy to his friend, the king of Thrace. With him, he had sent a vast treasure so that if Troy should fall, his surviving child might have means to gather the scattered people and perhaps rebuild the town. In this boy, now a young man, lay all the queen's consolation. She did not yet know, though she was soon to learn, that on hearing of Troy's destruction, the king of Thrace would murder the lad for the sake of his treasure. What a waste. No one, he believed, could call him to account for his treachery, but in this he erred. When the Greek fleet was to rest at Thrace on their homeward way, Hecuba, pretending ignorance of her son's death, would entice the king into the camp by offering to entrust him with the secret of more treasure that had been buried in Troy. The covetous king would come eagerly, and the captives, overpowering him by their numbers, would take terrible revenge. All this lay yet in the future. Now Hecuba was able to take courage in the thought of this one son as she watched Talthybus, the oldest of the Greek heralds. There they are, all the women, waiting to be redistributed like cattle. Talthybus, the oldest of the Greek heralds, coming slowly across the browned grass toward them with a group of servants at his heels. He was a tall man with a broad, pleasant face, just now twisted into unnatural sternness by the unwelcome task before him. He halted in front of the motionless queen and cleared his throat. "The lots are drawn, Hecuba," he said awkwardly. "You are to be Odysseus's slave." "Not Odysseus's slave." Hecuba's hands went up into her straggling hair and clutched it while her voice cracked weirdly. "Must I learn to bow and scrape before the dreadful man whom we in Troy hate above all other Greeks?" "His wife, Penelope, is a gracious lady," said Talthybus kindly, "and Odysseus himself is merciful toward those who obey." "I never thought to need the mercy of that man. However, any misery that comes must needs be brief. What of my daughters? They, poor things, are young." The herald's hand went to his beard in hesitation, and he glanced at the servants behind him for support. "Cassandra is for Agamemnon," he said quickly. "Never fear for her. The king loves her and will make her his bride, in despite of Clemestra, his wife." "Ah, I know." The old queen glanced at her unseeing daughter, who sat alone, covered as with a cloak by her silvery hair. "Take her. She is crazed by this night's terrors, and, I think, realizes nothing of her plight or ours." "Yes, mother, I know it all," said the prophetess, softly, without moving. "I am ready. You thought me too tender for war, but I tell you that none of us shall have vengeance braver and bloodier than mine." Remember, she knows the future. It's just that nobody believes her. That's her curse. "I am glad at least you are willing," said the herald, looking with pity on the strange girl. "You and your sister must rise and come with me." "Polysena, what is in store for her?" cried the agonized mother, while the girl shuddered all over and crouched lower on the ground. "No life of misery awaits her," replied the herald hastily. "Some evil is planned, I'm sure of it," exclaimed the queen, frightened by the man's embarrassment. Talthybus stood irresolute for a moment, as though hesitating how to break the news. "She is to be slain as a sacrifice by the tomb of Achilles," he stated abruptly at last. Hecuba cried aloud and clung to her daughter, but the girl now got up steadily, putting her mother away. "This is good news, mother," she said gravely. "I dreaded a life of sorrow and shame. It is better to die." She turned to the herald. "Let us go while my mother is still stunned by the news," said she. Talthybus made no move to take her, but stood hesitating. "There is also Andromache," he stated finally. Hecuba, hanging on her daughter's neck, paid no heed to this, but Andromache herself, who sat on the ground with her child asleep on her lap, turned white as death. "What of me?" she demanded quietly. "Pyrrhus takes you. Have no fear, for he has heard that you are gentle and of good repute, so that already he loves you." "A curse lies on me," she answered bitterly. "If my very virtues are to bring down on me the worst fate of all, am I to be loved by savage Pyrrhus, whose father slew my husband and all my kin?" "Be comforted," said Polysena gently. "You still have Hector's child." "As to the child," stammered Talthybus. "Yes," said the mother, anxiously pressing the boy to her. "Surely he goes with me. He is so young." "He is little now," said the herald reluctantly. "But his father was a great hero and one whom the Greeks feared. They dare not let the son of such a man grow up to trouble them. The child must die." "No!" screamed Andromache desperately, tightening her hold upon her son. I am charged to say, mumbled Tithbalbus, that if you let him go without an outcry, you may bury him with honor and send him down to dwell in Hades happily. If you resist, his corpse will be thrown out unburied in the open plain. Let him go, said Hecuba drearily. They will take him in any case, and we can at least send the son of my great son down to the dead like a prince. Andromache clasped the child silently, tears streaming down her white face, but she got up when the soldiers came over to her and followed them, unresisting. Hecuba sank to the ground again and covered her eyes, listening to the sound of shuffling sandals moving away across the grass. The Greeks hurled Hector's baby from the highest tower of Troy. After that grim deed, Pyrrhus took Andromache home with him and was as gentle as his nature allowed him to be, for he loved her dearly. He would not marry her, however, because she was only a slave, and he preferred the daughter of Menelaus and Helen, who had been promised him before he came to Troy. When the princess saw that her husband, Pyrrhus, loved his slave girl, her pride was affronted, and she plotted with a cousin to take Pyrrhus's life. Pyrrhus was slain, but Andromache was saved from her persecutors and married Helenus, whom the Greeks had spared because he had told them to capture the Palladium. Helenus and Andromache never went back to Troy, but they lived and died in peace, if not in happiness. Hecuba set out with Odysseus, but she did not live long after her vengeance on the king of Thrace. Some say that the gods changed her to a dog whose desolate howling could be heard ringing through the northern woods. Others declared that her mind gave way under her troubles and that she threw herself overboard to drown. Troy was razed to the ground, and none of the few who escaped returned to rebuild it. Antenor and his sons, who had been granted their lives in return for Thanos' treachery in betraying the Palladium, retired to neighboring cities. Aeneas and his followers set out for Italy in the long migrations that were to end with the founding of Rome. Interesting. So that really was just a bookend for all the women. It kind of jumped time a little bit, sometimes far into the future, sometimes a short distance into the future, but it sort of sealed all the fates of all of the women and then what became of them. That was really interesting. Okay, I'll come back for part 6, and that wraps up the rest of everybody else's life.